At 42 years old, gospel star Leandria Johnson has finally broken her silence, and the name she mentioned shocked everyone. For years, whispers followed her rise, her struggles, and her very public falls. But now, Leandria is no longer dodging the question people have been afraid to ask out loud. Did one of the most powerful pastors in America play a role in her pain? And why is this confrontation happening now, after years of rumors, sermons, and silence? What you're about to hear connects dots the church world never wanted connected. For years, Leandria Johnson has been one of the most gifted yet controversial voices in gospel music. From winning Sunday Best to delivering raw, soul-stirring performances, her talent was never in question. But alongside the anointing came very public struggles: battles with addiction, social media meltdowns, canceled performances, and moments that left fans confused and divided. At the same time, Pastor Creflo stood as one of the most influential figures in modern Christianity, a global ministry, massive following, and a theology that shaped how millions viewed faith, money, and accountability. To many, he represented spiritual authority; to others, controversy. What happens when a wounded artist and a powerful pastor's influence collide? In this video, we're going to break down what Leandria Johnson has hinted at, what she has directly said, and what insiders claim has been happening behind closed church doors for years. We'll examine the moments that led up to this confrontation, the sermons and statements that raised eyebrows, and why this situation is exploding now, not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, but right now. This isn't about rumors for the sake of drama. It's about documented moments, public statements, and a pattern that many believe has been ignored for too long. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Leandria's words are sending shockwaves through the gospel community, and why this story is far from over. To understand why this confrontation carries so much weight, we have to rewind to who Leandria Johnson was before the world knew her name. Long before the scandals, the Instagram lives, and the controversy, Leandria was simply known as a powerhouse vocalist with a church upbringing rooted deeply in gospel tradition. Music wasn't just her talent, it was her survival. She grew up surrounded by faith, but also by real-life struggles that shaped her emotionally and spiritually. That rawness would later become both her greatest strength and her biggest vulnerability. When she won BET's Sunday Best in 2010, it felt like a divine breakthrough. Millions watched as she sang with a pain that felt authentic, unpolished, and deeply human. Gospel fans didn't just hear her voice, they felt her wounds. Industry leaders immediately saw her as the next big thing in gospel music, and with that came expectations that went far beyond singing. Almost overnight, Leandria was no longer just an artist, she became a symbol, a role model, a representative of holiness in an industry that often pretends broken people don't exist. And that's where the pressure began to crack her foundation. Behind the scenes, those close to Leandria have said she struggled with the sudden shift from being ministered to being expected to minister flawlessly. There was little room for mistakes, little grace for healing in public, and almost no patience for relapse or emotional breakdowns. Her pain didn't disappear, it just went underground. And here's where things get even more complicated. As her profile grew, so did her proximity to powerful church leaders, conferences, and ministries. Invitations poured in, mentorship opportunities were offered, spiritual covering was discussed openly in gospel culture. Those relationships matter because who covers you often determines who protects you. This is the environment where names like Creflo begin to enter the conversation, not as accusations yet, but as influence, authority, theology, and expectations. Leandria would later hint that certain teachings made her feel spiritually trapped rather than healed. Teachings that emphasized victory without addressing trauma, prosperity without processing pain, strength without space for weakness. At the time, few people noticed the warning signs, but looking back, many fans now say they were there all along, hidden in her interviews, her music, and her tears on stage. And then came the fall. publicly, painfully, and with no place to hide. But what most people didn't realize is that this was only the beginning of a much deeper conflict, one that would quietly build for years before finally being spoken out loud. Because once Leandria began unraveling in public, the question became clear: who was really helping her heal, and who was just watching her break? By the time Leandria Johnson's struggles reached the public eye, they didn't arrive quietly, they exploded. Fans first noticed something was wrong not through tabloids, but through her own transparency. Late-night social media lives, emotional outbursts, tearful confessions that felt less like attention-seeking and more like someone drowning without a lifeline. For a gospel artist, this level of raw honesty was almost unheard of and deeply uncomfortable for an industry built on polished appearances. Leandria wasn't hiding her pain anymore. She spoke openly about addiction, exhaustion, and feeling abandoned by the very systems that celebrated her when she was winning awards. Concerts were missed, appearances were canceled, videos circulated faster than explanations ever could. And instead of the church world responding with unified compassion, the response was split. Some defended her fiercely, arguing that broken people deserve grace. Others quietly distanced themselves. Invitations slowed, support became conditional. The same stasis that once applauded her now whispered about her. This is where many fans began asking a question that had nothing to do with Leandria's talent and everything to do with accountability. Why did it seem like she was being judged more harshly than the leaders who preached to her? In several interviews and live moments, Leandria hinted at feeling spiritually shamed rather than restored. She spoke about being told to speak victory instead of being allowed to sit in healing, about being reminded of calling, purpose, and anointing without anyone addressing trauma, addiction, or mental health in real terms. And that's where theology enters the picture. Creflo Dollar's teachings, particularly around faith, confession, and prosperity, have been widely influential across gospel and church culture. His emphasis on grace, faith declarations, and living above circumstances inspired millions, but critics have long argued that those teachings sometimes leave little room for public failure. Leandria never accused Creflo Dollar directly during this period, but she referenced messages she had received from powerful pulpits, messages that made her feel like her struggles were evidence of spiritual weakness rather than human pain. Fans began connecting dots. Why were struggling artists encouraged to stay silent while leaders preached abundance and victory? Why did accountability feel heavier on singers than shepherds? And why did Leandria seem to be fighting her battles alone? The tension reached a breaking point when Leandria began pushing back, not angrily, but honestly. She spoke about needing real help, not religious slogans, about being tired of performing strength while privately unraveling. And still, the silence from leadership was loud. No public intervention, no visible pastoral covering stepping forward, no clear statement of restoration, just distance. That absence would later become one of Leandria's biggest grievances, because in her words, abandonment hurts more when it comes from people who preach love. But what truly changed everything wasn't just her struggle, it was the moment Leandria realized that her pain wasn't unique, it was time. As time went on, something shifted inside Leandria Johnson. Her pain stopped feeling isolated and started feeling familiar. During her quieter moments away from the spotlight, Leandria began hearing stories that mirrored her own. Other gospel artists, worship leaders, choir directors, people who served faithfully, sang powerfully, and gave everything to the church, yet were quietly struggling behind closed doors. Addiction, depression, burnout, and when they reached out for help, many received the same response: pray harder, speak faith, don't embarrass the ministry. This realization hit Leandria hard because what she once thought was a personal failure now looked like a systemic issue. She began addressing this more openly in interviews and live conversations, questioning why gospel culture celebrated brokenness in music but rejected broken people in real life. why testimony was welcomed only after healing, never during the process, and why leaders with influence rarely addressed the emotional cost placed on those serving under them. This is where the conversation around Creflo Dollar became unavoidable, not because Leandria accused him of personal wrongdoing, but because his teachings symbolized a broader theological mindset that many artists said left them feeling unseen. Messages about victory, dominion, and faith-filled living were powerful, but when applied without balance, they often made struggling believers feel like they had failed God. Leandria spoke about how certain teachings made her feel powerful on Sunday, but ashamed on Monday. How sermons about grace didn't always translate into grace when leaders were disappointed. About being reminded of calling, purpose, and anointing without anyone addressing trauma, addiction, or mental health in real terms. And that fear, the fear of losing platforms, support, and covering, kept many silent. Fans began revisiting sermons, conference lineups, and